I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features Vivian Gornick, one of the foremost practitioners of the art of personal narrative writing in America today. She's the author of Fierce Attachments, The Odd Woman in the City, The Situation and the Story, among many others. Her most recent book of essays is called Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. I recently had the pleasure of visiting Vivian in her Greenwich Village apartment to talk about unfinished business and the books that made her the writer she is and the books she reads over and over again. Hi, I'm Mike Kelleher. I'm the director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes here at Yale University, and I'm very excited today to be talking to prize recipient Vivian Gornick about her most recent book, Unfinished Business, Notes of a Chronic Rereader. So Vivian, why don't we talk just briefly about the book itself? Like, what was the impetus to writing Unfinished Business?
Actually, it was sort of a fluke. A friend of mine suddenly had a yen to reread Howard's End, a book we'd all read in college, and I hadn't read in at least 30 years. And she asked me if I would reread it with her. So I said, sure, thinking that I was just going to rediscover everything that I read before, and that I would help her in that way figure out her own thoughts, which is what she wanted. So I read it and I was shocked to see that, first of all, I'd gotten everything wrong. I remembered it deeply and all wrong. I mean, as I said finally in the introduction. But more important than that, I saw more clearly than I ever had before kind of the hidden narrative beneath the narrative, and the difficulty, the real profound difficulty, which stunned me, that I felt Forster had in writing the book. So I wrote a little piece about that, and Eileen Smith, who was a talented, you know Eileen? Oh yes, of course, Eileen is at Yale. Oh, so she's at Farrar Straus. So Eileen calls me up and says, this is a book, sit down and write it. And I thought, oh, that's an idea, because I had such pleasure in rediscovering it. Then I was alone with the idea, and then what did I do? So I literally just went through my bookshelves and I stopped at every book, many books that I knew had really compelled me in the past. And I thought, oh, let me take a look at this. I haven't looked at this in many, and that's literally the way it went. Then my job was to find the right transitions. And as I sought that clarification, how likely it was that this book would follow that book, more and more, some larger project began to clarify for me. So it really was, this book was a true act of discovery on my part, a discovery of a subject, of the subject, and it was all based on an emotional connection to each and every one of them, which I was investigating.
So with rereading, it's interesting you talk about going back to that book that you realized that you remembered very little of in terms of the facts of the book, and yet something outside of those facts stays with you.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how memory works there. As somebody who's deeply invested in memory as a part of your writing practice and writing memoirs, and there's this desire to get at the factual truth of something, and yet to also recognize that there's some other truth behind that that's separate from the facts.
That is the essence of it. The facts never matter, just like the subject never matters. That was why I said that, because the idea that, for instance, there are a set of facts that can be stolen, or it's a subject. You can't steal my subject. Well, there is no subject, and there are no facts that can be stolen, because it's the arrangement that the writer imposes that gives it its meaning. So it was a way of saying, this is a superficial way of looking at it. I mean, at the same time, though, I'm implying when I say, gee, I got it all wrong. Still, I remember that it held me. It holds me now. What is that all about? And that's when I go into my inspection of what the book is really all about. So I said that in order to call attention to the superficiality that is attached to the idea of the facts.
Yeah.
It's not the facts, it's the arrangement and that the writer gives it, and the depth of emotion that is revealed in that arrangement. And I got the Forster one wrong, but it was there. In other words, I got it wrong, but it was an equivalent. What I got right was an equivalent of what I was going to rediscover 30 years later.
So you begin the book with D.H. Lawrence.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that is sort of a through line with your engagement with that book, and I think ends up being kind of a through line for the whole story that you're telling in this book, is this idea of passion. And there's this kind of passionate reading, and then there's this kind of reading to discover the grand passion in oneself, and then there's this reading to discover passion as a form of sexual liberation, and then there's this discovery that sexual liberation doesn't actually deliver what it promises, and so forth. And I wonder
I'm sounding like a lunatic. No.
Well, but I feel like there's like passion, certainly for the young reader, right? Certainly for the person coming to someone like D.H. Lawrence for the first time. That's what the passion is, what you're seeking to discover. And I wonder if you could just talk about, you know, your passion as a reader at a certain moment in your life, and compare it as you've phased through D.H. Lawrence over the years, and the way that you've come to reread the idea of passion in literature.
Well, in Lawrence, we were talking specifically about a passion, sexual passion. We're talking about what he thought of as the liberation of sexual passion. The reason I start with Lawrence is, as I say, it was the first book of literature that I identified as literature. It was the first time I understood that a book is not just about what its surface story is, that it is talking about deep and profound things. I realized that I'd always been touched by the deep and profound things that a writer was getting at. I just couldn't name it. I just didn't know. The fact that the subject was actually sexual passion made it easy for a girl like myself to identify with, to see it operating in yourself, and to realize that what I was feeling could be made to serve some larger, deeper meaning was thrilling. And in fact, it's a thrill that I've never had equaled. There's no thrill in the life of a literary person that is deeper, or even its equivalent. And it's in that piece that I lay the groundwork for the whole book. Everything that is to come really will go back to that recognition that I'm not the same person each time I read, and the book stays the same. I change, and therefore then the book changes, and that's what Lawrence meant to me, and then and means to me now.
And that's another sort of story that I think carries through most of this book, is that reading and rereading is this search to discover yourself,
oneself,
and the sort of ongoingness of that, and the changingness of that, and the recognition of having been one person at one moment in your life, and perhaps another, or an altered version of that person at certain other points, which, as you transition into the next chapter on Colette, I think is fascinating.
Colette.
You have a rather stark metaphor at the very beginning. You said, Colette left me with the bad taste of revised feelings in my mouth.
Yeah, it's true. It was all true. Colette really hurt me more than anything else. As I say in the book, when I was 22 years old, me and my most literary friends, we adored her. She was wisdom itself. She was our book of wisdom, our Bible, because as I say, she was telling us who we were to become. And that was, and again, it was this notion of being utterly devoted to a life of passion. That passion, and all we meant was sexual passion, which is what all the great books always mean. You know, what Anna Karenina means, what Emma Bovary means, they are, sexual passion is taken to be the highest, deepest experience that one can have, and with it, one is experiencing a brilliant life. Without it, that life is pedestrian, no matter what else happens. For Colette elevated sexual passion at a time when, you know, like The Vagabond was written in 1910, at a time when, just to speak of it, was impermissible. But she lays it all out exactly as anyone would today. However, what she also lays out is that this is worth sacrificing everything for. Any young woman who read that in those years, we dreamed, it was as if we were like on the Crusades, we dreamed of sacrificing ourselves to great passion. Now, I felt when I read her that this achieved metaphor, obviously. I thought it was something profound about the human experience, the human condition, that she was using sexual passion to make me feel what it is to be alive, what it is to be a human being. You reread it today, and you know, you're smiling already. You can't imagine any young woman reading it as I read it at 23. That speaks for itself. And I'm not sure I would have written about it if I hadn't gone back and reread Sherry and The Last of Sherry, and then seen more deeply into the way the French use passion in literature. And it was then that I saw how anomic their work is, how what anomie motivates the French, and how wearying it is.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the identification with characters, right? And there's this sense of how, especially, I mean, Lawrence is, but you know, you talk about at different points in the book how when you go back and you reread, there's this identification with different characters, or maybe coming to an understanding of certain characters that you were dismissive of at earlier points in your life. And I wonder if you could talk about those identifications and re-identifications as sort of signposts for this sort of discovery of the self.
Well, two that exist in the book that I can think of right off the bat. One is an obvious choice. That was Sue Brighthead. Sue Brighthead, whom I identified with deeply from the very beginning. And I read that book too, Jude the Obscure, many, many times. And there I passed through a process that was sort of not unique, but important, significant, that a character whom I had loved deeply, I no longer love. Not only did I not love, I stood in severe judgment on. Nevertheless, she stood me in good stead, because as I judged her, I judged myself. I saw myself. And whereas I extended her a huge amount of sympathy in the old days, in times when I could read Thomas Hardy as though he were an explicator of social forces. And now I saw him mainly psychologically, through her, more than any other character in all that work, which is not a large amount of work. But she is the one character with whom I thought he saw the most clearly the way in which the human psyche does itself in, the way it refuses to allow you to advance. So before that, I saw Sue much more as a feminist, actually, in terms of social forces. Look at what she can do, what she can't do. Look at her, the punishment she receives for trying to live like a man, et cetera, et cetera. But that was not true. That's not what the book is really about, and that's not what she's really about. Now, I could read it maybe 20 years from now, and I'll say something else is what it's really about, and I hope that would be true. Yeah. But this I know is true. The other character who took me by surprise, whom I identified with in a startling way, was Billy Pryor in Regeneration. The last person in the world, the last character in the world that you would imagine me that I would imagine me identifying with. But I did. There's a point in the book where Billy, who's a profound womanizer, picks up an officer, and they have homosexual sex. And the guy says to him, "Do you do bottoms?" I think that's what he said to him. And Billy said, "I do everything." Or "I do anything." I can't remember. I think everything. I do everything. That went through me like a dose of salts. I could hear the people I grew up with. I could just hear them. And it was thrilling to me. I could feel the antisocial meanness in him. And I loved it. I knew where he came from. I came from the same place. And I had nothing but the thrill of recognition from that character.
It feels like it also leads you to that moment. I wrote down a quote, which I'll read back to you. But that moment in the chapter, here you say, "I was grateful that I'd been allowed a life that had taken me from that single-minded bloodlust to the pain and confusion brought on by the gap in myself between practice and theory, the one that forced on me recognition of all the human exceptions to the ideological rule."
Oh my God. Yeah, where did I write that?
That was in that chapter on regeneration.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, you had been talking about your identification with that sort of working class bloodlust, that certainty, that ideological certainty of the working class character, and yet you sort of glide into this other moment where you recognize in yourself also that you've developed that distance between the passion and the dispassionate observation of it. And
that book was very important to me. Yes, it taught me a lot. It made me see a lot more clearly. There's one thing very interesting about English literature, about British literature, and that is what the First World War means to them. Not the second, but the first. And almost all of them, the deepest feelings that they have, the deepest insights that they acquire, the deepest sense of what it is to be a human being, who associate to war, it's always the First World War. And somehow or other, she has that incredible connection here, more than with any other book she's ever written.
I want to read to you my favorite sentence in the whole book. At the beginning of the Elizabeth Bowen chapter. "Between what we know and what we cannot hope to know about how we come to be as we are lies an emotional dumping ground into which exceptional writers pour all the art they are capable of making."
I'm thrilled. Well, it's just the simple truth. Yes, it took a long time for me to think that one out. It did, but it was my great pleasure to do so. But it's exactly true, right? It's exactly true. Between what we know and what we can't possibly know is where the writer moves in. Is where that floundering and that drowning struggle takes place to identify what you can only barely feel, touch, perceive. It's what is meant by words are not enough. You spend your life trying to find the words that will be enough, and you never do. And then there are writers who really truly remind you of that effort immensely, and she's one. Elizabeth Bowen was one. I think probably rereading her was the greatest satisfaction I had in writing this book.
And why is that?
Because you spoke before of a writer, Renee Gladman.
Renee Gladman, yeah. One of your fellow prize recipients.
Right. Whose work I am not familiar with, but you spoke of her as writing a kind of abstract prose that is not, whose meanings are not readily available to the reader. And yet, almost everybody who reads her is haunted by her work or is much taken. Well, Bowen certainly was a writer of that sort. Her writing her sentences are eccentric. Her syntax is very deeply difficult. And therefore, you have a hard time knowing exactly what she's writing about. When I was young and I read her, I couldn't figure it out at all. Now, when I read her, I felt I could. I mean, it was as if invisible writing became visible. And I felt that she knew something very, very important, how afraid of feeling we are. And that this was her wisdom. As she said, life with the lid on, emotional life with the lid on, and that's how we live, and what a desecration that is. And she was able to put that feeling into an enormous amount of writing. And that was miraculous. I loved her for it, and reminded me of what I had learned, because I remembered so clearly not being able to make head or tail out of what she was talking about. And now suddenly it was like water clear. So.
Well, that's, in another section of the book, one of the things that I really felt powerfully myself was you talk about receptivity and just being at that particular moment in your life, which doesn't necessarily have to do with age or anything, but just being at the right place in the right time to receive something. And yes. I think Bowen is a writer like that. She's not somebody who anybody can jump into at any moment in their life and receive that. But when you're ready to receive it, I recently had that same experience with Shirley Hazard.
Oh yes,
there's another one where it's the same. There's the Transit of Venus.
Yes.
And it just, I don't know what it is, where you just have to slow it down and just stay there.
Yeah, I was thinking of writing about her. I had also read Transit of Venus in college, and I didn't, not in college. I mean, it was written in the 80s. But I read it when it came out.
When it came out, yeah.
And I didn't think much of it. Now I reread it, and I was stunned by it. Now that too is a book that you feel you have to come to in some maturity. You can't come to it as a very young person. There are great writers whom, Herman Melville, you can read at any age, and there are many, many great writers whom you can read at any age, make what you will of it at any age. And then there are writers you absolutely need to have experience and maturity in order to read, in order to get what they are talking about.
Yeah. The other writer who I think seems like absolutely essential to you in this book is Natalia Ginzburg.
Oh, yes.
And interestingly,
for different reasons.
Also, she's the only one about whose nonfiction you write about in the book. You seem so deeply moved. Everybody else, you're talking about their fiction.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that. Why is it? I mean, first of all, what is it about Natalia Ginzburg's nonfiction that is so important to you? But why is it that it's actually the fiction that you keep going back to and wanting to talk about again and again and again, rather than the nonfiction?
You're just now making me realize that was true. I didn't really concentrate. I didn't realize that. Well, it is storytelling that is compelling, definitely. So obviously, fiction is always storytelling. It's rare that nonfiction is or in my experience, is storytelling in the same way that, that a writer takes it takes a piece of human experience and in a nonfiction way and decides to shape it in the way that a fiction writer would. And Ginsberg was my lodestar with that. I mean, she was the one who showed me that it can be done and the way in which it can be done. She's important to me just because she showed me the kind of writer that I could be. It's that, so she is odd woman out in this collection. But it is in my own life, I have longed to be a storyteller and have my entire life as a writer has been a struggle to find a way to become a storyteller. And I'm not sure that I have ever done it. I think so, but I looked upon Fierce Attachments, the memoir, as a means of telling a story. I realized very early that if a memoir is not telling a story rather than recording the facts of something, if it's not capturing a piece of experience through a dramatization of it, it's worthless. And when I discovered her, I saw what you could really do with this. And every single one of her essays is a story. And that's why she means so much to me. She did it beautifully and brilliantly. And I came to really respect deeply that she holds your attention even though you don't really know where she's going until the very end. But she holds your attention all the way through. Yeah. You don't ever at any point say, where is she going with this? As you do with so many writers who make you restless, who just are not compelling enough. There's nothing she writes about. It's the cast of her mind. It's the way she sees things. It's interesting. The whole journey is worth it, as well as the arrival. And there are very few nonfiction writers who can do that. So that's what she always meant to me, and still does. I mean, I reread her as you would your mentor. And every time I do, I say, that's how she does it.
Are there any books that you left out that you tried to write about and just couldn't, or that you wrote about and it just didn't work in the book? Or are there books that you just felt like it doesn't fit in this book, but gosh, I wish I could have put this in here?
Well, in the end, Howard's End did not make the cut. I couldn't find a way to make it function with all the other books. Sure, there were lots of books as the thing began to take shape. In the end, everything got sacrificed to the idea of shape, to making a book, instead of saying, I must have this, I must have that. That's a lesson I learned a long time ago. And you'd be amazed at how many, you're not amazed, you look at what gets published, and you can see how many people have not been taking that lesson to heart. That the most important thing is the shape of the book and whether or not a thing is a book and can be standalone as a work, a discrete work. Which is what I think every writer should be devoted to.
Well, thank you, Vivian. It's been really a pleasure talking
My
to you.
pleasure,
and
too.
Congratulations again on receiving the Windham-Campbell Prize this
Thank
year.
you so much.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
In school, the teacher held a composition of mine up to the class when I was 8 years old and said, "This little girl is going to be a writer." At home, where Marx, socialism, and the international working class were articles of faith, my mother pressed my upper arm between two fingers and said, "Never forget where you come from." Both events were formative. I grew passionate over writing, and the politicalness of life was never lost on me. In my youth, these twin influences made me suffer I thought them hopelessly oppositional and was tormented by the suspicion that ultimately I need choose one way of knowing the world over the other. It was literature that spoke most thrillingly to what I was already beginning to call the human condition. But when social injustice stared me in the face, it was easy enough to trade in emotional nuance for doctrinaire simplicity. So one day, it was exciting to say to myself, the only reality is the system. The next, I'd pick up Anna Karenina, and the sole reality of the system would do a slow dissolve. I entered college, and somewhere in my junior year, something interesting happened. A drama of internal anguish that subsumed all else began to unfold. The words anxiety and depression entered my vocabulary. Conflicts I had never before paid attention to became alarming. In no time at all, an unimagined universe of interiority opened before me, one equipped with its own theory, laws, and language, and constituting a worldview that could account for everything. This was strong stuff. Under its influence, both literature and politics began to lose their either-or power over me. I didn't stop reading, and I didn't stop signing petitions, but I no longer felt commanded to choose. Then, before I knew it, it was 1970, and feminism was standing boldly on the horizon, urging me to take in its wisdom. The unlived lives of women began to seem not simply a drama of the psyche, but a crime of historic intent that could be solved only through a movement for social justice. This was an insight that, to every generation of feminists since the Enlightenment, had come like revelation. And like revelation, it lit up a convert's sky, coloring every feature of the human landscape. The kaleidoscope of life had been shaken, and all the familiar pieces now formed a new design, one that illuminated the way we spoke, read, thought, and wrote. Keep looking through that prism, we told ourselves, and we'd have every explanation ever needed. Then, problematically, the design complicated itself once more. Although the rhetoric continued to run high, soon enough, 70s feminists came to realize that while they stood united in political analysis, ideology alone could not purge them of the pathological self-doubt that seemed every woman's bitter birthright. For that, another kind of struggle was required, one for which a man, not a woman, supplied the tagline. As Anton Chekhov so memorably put it, others made me a slave, but I must squeeze the slave out of myself drop by drop. Suddenly, literature, politics, and analysis came together, and I began to think more inclusively about the emotional imprisonment of mind and spirit to which all human beings are heir. In the course of analytic time, it became apparent that, with or without the burden of social justice, the effort required to attain any semblance of inner freedom was extraordinary. Great literature, I then realized, is a record not of the achievement, but of the effort. With this insight as my guiding light, I began to interpret the lives and work of women and men alike who had spent their years making literature. But it was in the lives of the men especially that one can see what it meant to wrestle with the demons. Here they were, talented, often brilliant, with infinitely more permission to do and be than women had ever known. And they were endlessly dragged about by conflicts they could neither give up nor bring under control. I could not but be moved by the great and the humble alike, to pity and admiration for those who demonstrated repeatedly that to be and do is not a given. V.S. Naipaul has very nearly been consumed by the raging self-hatred that powers his work. George Gissing labored under an equally strong self-loathing that made social exile his natural milieu. Randall Jarrell fed a passion for poetry on the fever of a defensive brashness that drove him ultimately into suicidal despair. While Lauren Isley made anthropologic poetry out of an isolating depression of monumental proportions, Allen Ginsberg became a holy fool, and Debussy, Carver, and Ford licked their sentimentalized wounds in story after story. Then, of course, there are Saul Bellow and Philip Roth, who have each produced brilliance upon brilliance out of an unremitting fury that he was born into a culture that persisted in telling him he had no right to measure up. Theirs is a fiction that for 40 years has screamed, "Don't tell me I don't run things around here." Against or because of or in spite of, who knows, such disability, each and every one of these writers has converted neurotic necessity into literary virtue and achieved work of lasting value that casts light on the time in which it was conceived. If indeed criticism is autobiography, this book, then, is a collection of essays written in appreciation of the working lives of literary men by a woman whose critical faculties have been shaped by a passion for literature, a hard-won knowledge of inborn anxiety, and a compelled devotion to liberationist politics. It is this last, I think, that is most responsible for the perspective vital to the making of these essays. The reawakening in my late youth of the centuries-long struggle for women's rights clarified the intimate relation between literature, emotional damage, and social history, made evident to me the organic nature of all that is meant by the word culture. It is my great hope that the reader will experience the development of this perspective, as I have, as an enrichment of the writing and reading experience.